I will say that at this point, we probably are looking at going back in and dealing with the other two sides at some point here relatively shortly. And then the four-sided release, yes, we released the tree on all four sides and opened it up. So in our stand, as I said, we laid these out. It was a broad intent to do a demo site for crop tree management, big picture. But when we finished, we realized that probably 80% to 90% of the trees on the site that were crop trees were these red silver crosses that we have that we call rovers. There were some sugar maple. We did include some other ones like dogwood and oak, and there are some cherry, but they were not huge numbers. The huge numbers fell on the maple side. We first released them in 2019. This is where some of those caveats, Jim and I can both talk about killing trees, but you really need to understand if your tree is a diffuse porous or a ring porous, because maples are diffuse porous, makes them very difficult to kill. We did not accomplish that in the first year. We had to go back in a second year and recut and apply more herbicide to try to get those trees to fall out of the canopy. To give you an idea between ring porous and diffuse porous, you can kind of see here that ring porous is very, very simple in that you're just going in and you're slicing through that ring to cut off the movement of nutrients and water up and down the tree. But for diffuse porous, you've got much larger territory. So you're going to have to go deeper. And typically, I talk about controlling diffuse porous trees with a double girdle, just because you want to try to get in there and kill off those rings as you can. A quick look to give you some idea, ring porous trees versus diffuse porous. There are some there's some info on this in our updated controlling undesirable trees and shrubs fact sheet. I added that in so that folks could make better decisions when they're going after trees that they're trying to knock out of the stand. So on the demonstration site, we did collect the SAP info in 2021, 2022, and 2023. 2024, we went in and we measured diameters again, but the grant that we had for collecting the sap and testing it fell in that 21 through 23 goal. We did not use the sap in production, and I always have to add that because if you look at that bucket, it's an old maple bucket and it's got lead in it, and so no using the sap for any food production. It all got dumped out. We had students who emptied the buckets every day, and we took measurements for sap produced and what that sugar content was. And here's that other thing I want to add in for crop tree. A lot of times when we talk about crop tree, we're talking about smaller, younger trees, right? You're going to release them and they'll react. We knew that these trees were compressed. They had a lot of competition and they were older. So you can kind of see here, our age ranges were in their 40s. So it's a little later than what most of the time we would talk about, but you'll see that they actually ended up responding fairly well. But again, when we went into this, it probably was a little bit older stand than what we typically talk about when we're talking about crop tree. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here. Just understand that you can see where the sap volume in the control side versus the four-sided. 2023 was a bad year for sap production all the way around. But you can see that that four-sided has added as we've gone through. There's a point here, though, where I expect it as the canopies close, we'll start to see less production there. Sugar content, though, sugar content on the four-sided went through the roof in many respects. So it was an interesting thing that maybe the sap production, the amount of sap we were collecting wasn't increasing, but the sugar content definitely increased and benefited from those open crowns and more room to grow. And then a quick overview on the diameters. You can see from 2018 to 2022, the diameter growth versus that 2018 and then up through 24. So they took a little while to kick into gear, but they definitely have put on growth in the last few years. So that's really, when you're thinking about crop tree, you're trying to, what are you trying to improve for the crop tree? And in this case, because I'm using this as a sugar bush demo, yes, we are trying to increase diameter, because the bigger the trees get, the more opportunity you may have to add an additional tap. But we haven't seen a lot of sap quantity increases, but we saw sugar content increase, which for a producer means you're going to be boiling less water off of that sap to get it down to the consistency that you want it for syrup. So again, you kind of go back to, what am I trying to accomplish? Did we get that with these crop trees? I feel like we did make a lot of progress, but we definitely have more to learn, and we'll continue to monitor as we can and keep you up to date on how things respond. But so for crop trees overall, you want vigorous dominant trees. You want trees that are already growing well. They're the dominant trees in the stand. There's no sense in releasing a tree that's already overtopped and struggling in kind of that mid-range and understory. So you go for the vigorous ones and the ones that are already dominant in the crown area, because you want those trees to have the energy reserves to reproduce. You want them to be able to have more light so that you stimulate more flowers and fruit and growth. You want that light aspect. And also part of that light aspect, as we'll look here in a minute, is going to hit the forest floor to help with regeneration for the next stand. But vigorous trees will have larger crowns. And, if you're trying to increase mast production, you want those vigorous trees to have large crowns, because you want them to produce more acorns. So it fits in a variety of ways, not just because I'm using the sugar maple as an example. So you can have, as I said, we typically think about crop tree release on younger trees, but I think here we proved that we could get some good response on some older trees. It may have taken them a little longer to kick into gear. I admit, when we marked it, I was a little worried at the age of the trees, whether they would respond and respond well, but I've been pleasantly surprised. They have not been stagnant when it comes to what we were measuring and what we were trying to accomplish. But it all goes back to what you're trying to accomplish. What are those objectives? What are your goals? And how do you do this? One of the easiest ways, I think, is you grab a couple rolls of flagging that are different colors. As you can see here, we used pink and orange. I think when I look at some of my photos, we should have gone with a bigger contrast in our colors. But I have turned many a landowner loose in a stand and said, go mark what you think are your crop trees. And then let's stand back and see what you think. Maybe go back in and flag in that other color what you think you're going to take out, and then stand back and look at it. That's usually where the landowners start going back in and pulling some flagging, but it's a whole lot easier to pull flagging because you're not going to put trees back up once you make that cut. So it's a nice exercise to be able to implement crop tree management. Pick the crop trees, pick some of those trees that you think you're going to remove to favor that crop tree, and then see if you're comfortable with that. Are you okay with cutting out that many trees? Or do you think maybe you can go a little heavier? It all just depends on the landowner. So again, here's kind of one of ours, and I wanted to show you up close. This is what happens. This tree lived through a couple of seasons, because if you look here on that left-hand side of the double girdle, you can see that the person that cut the girdle did not go deep enough in order to sever all the tissue for the tree. So key point, you don't want to walk out there next year and see all those trees you spent all that time girdling, leafing out and doing just fine. Kind of that perspective from standing back, you look out through the woods, you can see your crop trees, you can see, you know, what you're going to drop. Are you comfortable with what it looks like? Does it make sense to what you're trying to accomplish? And again, this is actually in the 4-sided cut. You can see a couple of the crop trees. You actually can see the chainsaw guy in the back dropping some of them. We did drop some. We did double girdle some. You have options when it comes to killing the tree. You have to think about if you're going to drop them, you want to make certain you're not damaging the residual trees. And if you're going to double girdle them or hack and squirt or whatever process you're going to use to kill them, are you okay that when that tree dies, that it comes down on its own? In some scenarios, you'd rather drop them and you pick where they go versus where Mother Nature is going to drop them for you when they die. But just some things to think about, because the last thing you want to do is drop trees on your crop trees. So beware and be cautious. But you can't just look up. We learned that the hard way, though we kind of knew some of what was going to happen, but it took us a little by surprise. So here's a look at the ground. You can see there's an ash seedling, there's an elm seedling, there's some poison ivy, there's some other vegetation that's in there that we had a little bit of. Okay, so what happens when you open up the stand and you open up to all that light? This is what it looked like before we cut. And welcome stiltgrass. Stiltgrass, barberry, privet, and autumn olive all came into the stand. Now, they probably all had little seedlings in that understory that we didn't pay as much attention to as we should have, but we opened it up, gave them all the sunlight they could want. And all of a sudden we had to deal with, especially the stiltgrass. The stiltgrass just took over. And so something that I'm in this day of invasive species, you can't not look at the ground and figure out what's going to come up and deal with. You have to pay attention to the invasives. And we learned that the hard way with the stiltgrass. We knew there were going to be some issues. As I said, it kind of caught us by surprise, but we had it treated last year. We're going to have a follow-up treatment shortly, and hopefully, you know, get it under control in the stand. Of course, the problem is on all of these, there's all sorts of these plants outside of this crop tree area. So it's not a one and done. You're going to have to continue to monitor because you've provided the perfect light source for these things to take over. So great practice, does what you're trying to do with the woods, but the consequences of the invasive species side can be huge if you're not paying attention to it. Quickly, I'm going to give you just a few tools that you might want to think about. The Healthy Woods app, as displayed here, is one that was done with a regional set of foresters. University of Kentucky kind of led the way. It's a nice little app to help you assess your own woods. So you put your info in, you answer a bunch of questions, you can take some pictures of your site, and it will analyze it and spit out some management thoughts. It may point you in the direction of some resources to help you make some of those next step decisions. Part of that app now links to our Ohio Forest Pests, the field guide we did a few years ago. So this was a hard copy that we produced almost 3 years ago now. And great data, great information, but you never know when you're going to have funds to be able to reprint. And so we took that and we put it online at this Eastern Forest Pests website. You can click on the pest guide and you can get a PDF of it, or you can go to the website and put in what you're looking for, and it will pop up like this for anthracnose. So it basically took what was in the book and it's put it online, and it's easier for us to also update when it's online. Elm zigzag sawfly is already in there, and it was not in the book. So last but not least, we have the Great Lakes Early Detection Network. So when you're dealing with the invasive species side, you can use the app to help you identify, and you can report different invasive species, plants, insects, diseases. There's just a bunch of options in there for what you're looking at. Good pictures to help you ID if you don't want to report. So it can be a really good tool for you as well. And Jim, I will stop there. So let me. There you go.
How does that look on your end?
Looks good.
Okay. So thank you very much, Kathy. With that, I'll kind of pick it up from there and kind of talk about a couple different methods that we would talk about when we're talking about growing and tending trees in our woodlands. And so what I really want to focus on is cull tree removal and midstory removal, which are basically types of active forest management where we're going in and we're making decisions. And one of the things that, rather than using healthy a lot for the way of describing how folks might be managing, the term that I really like to use rather than just healthy is the word thriving, because I think the word thriving helps include the idea of having a healthy forest, but also having a productive forest, one that is doing and growing well. But we'll talk about the applications of a couple of different types of techniques, and then talk about, importantly, a way that you might be able to get some funding to be able to help pay to get some of this work done on your property, or to help incentivize you to get some of this work done on your property. And that's through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. But I'll talk about that a little bit more at the very end. So just to think a little bit about um, where we're at in the life of a forested stand when we're talking about things like crop tree release, or the couple types of treatments that I'll be getting into, is really we're getting into that kind of this stand tending area, where what we're looking at is we're not looking at restarting the forest, but really what we're looking at doing is ways to try to improve the growth of our forest, or try to improve the quality of the forest somehow. And so essentially, if you look at the kind of the full life of a stand, there's a lot of time throughout the life of a forest where you can do some really good tending work within that forest to improve it for the future. And as Kathy mentioned, and this is worth reiterating, prior to doing any types of canopy removal or modifying the amount of light that is going to reach the forest floor, it is very important to look around for those non-native invasive species, because you can make a bad problem very much worse if you're not careful. So here's just an example of kudzu, which is known as the plant that ate the South, growing right here in southern Ohio, actually in Athens County. And one thing that surprises a lot of people about this invasive, they primarily think of it as a southern species, and kind of rightly so, but it actually exists in more than half of our counties here in the state. So it is a very important invasive, and there's a whole host of other really important invasive species, but it's really important to get a handle on these invasive species prior to doing any type of harvesting within the woodland. So how do we go about removing trees? If we're looking at controlling unwanted vegetation, there are a handful of different techniques. The two most commonly sought after ways of removing vegetation is going to be with a chainsaw or through the use of herbicides. Those are usually our primary methods of manipulating stands. However, there's occasions where we may be looking at using prescribed fire, or occasionally looking at mowing, although that's generally restricted to plantations, where we're just trying to modify competing vegetation with those trees. And so we'll talk a little bit about um, pros and cons of chainsaws versus herbicides coming up as we dive into some of the methods. So when we talk about forest stand improvement, um, we're as a silviculturist, as somebody who manages forest as a forester, I tend to refer to these as intermediate treatments, things that we're doing during the midlife of the stand to try to improve the quality, try to improve that growth of the forest. So the different types of treatments, while this isn't a comprehensive list, from crop tree release, cull tree removal, midstory removal, thinning, oat wilt control. The reason why I've highlighted these 5 different things is these are potentially types of treatments that can be done in your woodlands that the Natural Resource Conservation Service may be willing to incentivize you to conduct. And really, Kathy's already done a nice job talking about crop tree release. I'm going to spend some time talking about cull tree removal and mid-story control. Not really going to get much into thinning, just because it kind of behaves similar to a type of mid-story control. And usually when we're talking about thinnings, we may be talking about thinning in plantations, or we may be talking about a commercial thinning where we're trying to generate a little bit of revenue. Um, and then the final there, oak wilt control, that's not something that we're going to really get into with this talk, but there is a mechanism of trying to um, keep that disease from spreading. So Kathy talked about kind of this idea a little bit earlier, but essentially, um, just like carrots that you may try to grow in your garden, um, if you've ever planted carrots, you know those seeds are exceptionally tiny, and if you're trying to lay those out in a row, it becomes nearly impossible to spread those an adequate distance apart. Inevitably, one of the things that you have to end up doing is you have to go back in and weed some of those carrots out. Otherwise, they grow too densely, and you're left with these wee little baby carrots, and you don't get that really nice taproot of a carrot. Trees are the same way. They need light. The more sunlight that you're going to give them, the better those trees are going to grow. Um, and so Kathy alluded to this a little bit in her presentation, but there is a relationship between how many trees that you have in your woodlands and the size of those trees with how well that they are going to grow. And so our forest, depending upon the type, every type has an optimal range for how big those trees should be and how many of them you can have on a given acre. And so what happens when you have too many trees of a given size within a forest? Essentially, what ends up happening is this size of the trees is going to be greatly reduced. Those canopy sizes are going to be greatly reduced, and you're going to start seeing a lot of stress, and you're going to see a lot of mortality occurring within that woodland. One way to think about this is a given acre can only produce so much volume in a given year. It can only grow so much wood over the course of a year. And when you are spreading that volume out across 1,000 trees, that amount of growth per tree is greatly diminished as compared to if you're spreading that growth all out across 200 trees or 400 trees. It's going to change the amount of growth that each tree can produce. So depending upon the species, you can get into these really stagnant stands where essentially the trees are growing exceptionally slow, which is not necessarily ideal because as a woodland owner myself, one of my objectives for the trees on my property is I want to grow big trees, and the faster I can grow big trees, the better. Not just because they potentially are going to be worth more from a timber standpoint, but also because they're going to be producing more fruit from a wildlife standpoint. And then selfishly, I'd rather look at big trees than I would small trees. So if I'm going to hike through a woods, usually I'm going to choose to hike through the woodland that has bigger trees versus smaller trees. But that's just personal preference, I suppose. When we get into kind of an ideal stand, what's occurring is what we would refer to as a fully stocked stand, is all the resources that are being provided in terms of sunlight, in terms of nutrients, essentially are being fully utilized. And so you're not losing growth, you're not losing trees to mortality. So the trees that you have there are growing very well, and they're healthy. Versus the other end of the spectrum, what happens when you have trees that are exposed to too much sunlight. So there is a time where, you could potentially harvest too many trees out of your woodland. What happens to those trees? Well, they're like the trees that are grown out in the field or trees that are grown near a parking lot. They tend not to be very tall. They tend not to be very straight. They tend to produce these very large crowns that are very spreading. Probably not the types of trees that you want to have growing in your woodland. Um, so one of the methods that I'm going to be talking about today is cull tree removal. And so to start out with, a definition for a cull tree is just simply a tree that has either no value or very low value. And I'll give you some different examples, and I'll actually go into a little bit more in depth as to what might constitute an undesired species versus a poor quality individual on some of these next slides. But just to give you an idea, one of the things that might constitute a tree with very low value is one that is being impacted by a disease or insects, or it may simply just be rather unhealthy. So when we're talking about value, who gets to decide what a valuable tree is versus a non-valuable tree? Well, ultimately, it's the landowner. It doesn't have to be value in terms of a dollar sign like I have there at the bottom right hand of the corner. It could just be a value standpoint of looking at the tree from a wildlife standpoint. Is this tree going to be producing a type of fruit that is going to be beneficial to wildlife that I want to see on my property? If not, maybe it's a tree that you might want to consider removing. But if it is a very valuable tree from a wildlife standpoint, that's a tree that you might want to keep and you want to try to manage for. So it really goes back to the landowner. What that's based on is your goals and objectives, why you own your land, and what it is you hope to be able to see, what it is that you hope to do on your woodland property. So we'll dive into some different examples of cull trees, and we'll talk a little bit here. So on the left-hand side of this, you have a red maple, which could be a desirable species in some stands, or could be undesirable depending upon your objectives, and I'll explain that. So if we're in an oak hickory stand where we're wanting to try to manage for oak, a red maple like this that has a really low fork and really large canopy is taking up a bunch of sunlight and probably would be considered an undesirable species. However, if you're managing this woodland as a sugar bush, as Kathy was talking about earlier, this might be a tree that you would certainly want to keep and you would want to try to manage for. So it really always goes back to those landowner objectives. Similarly, with that middle tree, the sourwood. So this is a tree from a forestry standpoint. Doesn't produce much in the way of timber value. It's really low value wood. Generally, it doesn't get to the size of being able to produce timber. Usually it's about as straight as a dog's hind leg that is exceptionally crooked. This is actually probably a photo of one of the straighter sourwoods I've actually ever seen. But if you were interested in, if you had honeybees on your property, sourwood is a great tree for pollinators. And so it might be a great tree for somebody that has bees and managing for those on their property. Similarly, the tree on the right, if you're interested in managing for oak and hickory and herbaceous vegetation on the understory, American beech is one of these trees that produces a very large, dense canopy and doesn't allow a lot of sunlight to reach the floor. And so if you look around the base of these trees, especially around beech, oftentimes you'll see not very much vegetation growing underneath them because there isn't a whole lot of sunlight reaching that forest floor. And so that can be an important component. Poor quality individuals, essentially one way to describe these trees is they're kind of sorry trees. So trees that just kind of look sorry, they just look sad. They just don't look like a nice architectural tree. There's just stuff wrong with them. So the tree on the left there, it's a multi-stem tree where a number of the different stems are dead. And essentially, one way to describe this is the the low quality tree there on the left, that red maple, no matter what you do with that tree, uh, it's going to always be a low quality tree. A different way to say that is, if you are going to make chicken salad, you're probably going to use the meat from a chicken and not the feathers to make that chicken salad. And so these low quality trees, when they're low quality, they're probably always going to be low quality throughout their life. The center tree, sassafras, that has a really noticeable fork there, a high likelihood of one of those sides of that tree busting off and seeing some significant canopy damage. And actually, already that if you follow that right side of the stem up, you'll see where basically half of that tree is already dead. Half of that canopy is already dead versus the left side of that tree looks to be still living. However, this still might not be a tree that everybody would want to remove. For those folks that really like southern flying squirrels, sassafras tends to be one of those trees that flying squirrels very much like to live in. And so one potential option could be to girdle this tree and try to leave it standing versus cutting it down and laying it on the ground. And so there's a lot of different ways in which we can try to remove trees. And depending on, why you're removing it, what you're hoping to accomplish, you might be looking at leaving it dead standing versus cutting it on the ground. On the right, there you have a black gum that has a really low fork. It's got some included branch growing into the other fork, but really a low value tree from a timber standpoint or from a firewood standpoint. But from a songbird perspective, these can produce very valuable fruit, as well as black gum can produce very bright red foliage in the fall, which that can be very important for landowners, especially if you have perhaps a vacation cabin or an area just off your porch where you have some black gum. Those black gums could be great trees to manage for in certain areas where you're going to be able to view them from areas that you spend a lot of time in. Diseased and insect impacted trees are oftentimes trees that we will focus in on. The tree on the left is an American elm that's being impacted most likely by Dutch elm disease. And so part of the idea with removing these disease and insect impacted trees is that while these trees are still alive and growing, they're taking up growth that otherwise could be put on other trees. And so the growth that they're putting on is essentially in some respects kind of wasted. Not that you couldn't use it for firewood, and not that it couldn't make structure, coarse woody debris, or a snag for wildlife, which can be beneficial. But it could be potentially wood that's produced in energy that goes into supporting a better quality tree. Similarly, the tree over there on the right is a white ash tree on my own property where basically about half of it is dead, and most of the canopy that you're seeing is epicormic sprouts coming off the branches, severely impacted by emerald ash borer. At this point, is there a need to remove the tree from a forest management standpoint? Probably not, just because this is Mother Nature's way of removing trees for us. However, if this tree were next to your house, next to a trail that you were commonly planning on walking, or if you had perhaps planted trees in the understory around this tree, maybe it would be a tree that you would want to go ahead and fall down to the ground rather than allowing it to stand and fall on its own. Others may just try to girdle that tree, let it basically put the tree out of its misery at this point, and allow it to be a snag, because there's over 100 different wildlife species that rely on snags for part of their life cycles. When we are looking at good quality trees versus low quality trees, one of the things that we like to look at is um, if they are seedling origin versus a sprout origin. So the example on the left in this kind of those center trees on that picture on the left, you see what we refer to as a V-shaped sprout. So essentially, these two red maple trees have heartwood that are connected to one another. And so if we were going to try to manage for one of these trees, we essentially have to manage for both of them. But unfortunately, because of the way that they're connected, these trees are going to continue to grow together. And as they're growing, they're going to be pushing each other apart. And be likely before these trees reach maturity, one of those trees is going to fall off. Whether it's the left side or the right side, it's really unclear. Unless you have a really nice crystal ball that you can use. I don't. So I would just take a guess that one of them is going to fall apart, and that's going to introduce a lot of rot into the other side of the tree. Versus the tree on the right, which is a pair of chestnut oaks, you can see that those stems are located away from each other. Those would be ideal trees to try to manage, because if you wanted to pick the tree on the right because it was a little bit larger, had a bigger healthy canopy maybe, it would be a tree that you could manage for while cutting that tree that's on the left side and not introduce any type of rot into the individual tree itself. Unhealthy trees, so trees that have really broken, busted tops. Maybe this is from ice damage, maybe it's from wind damage. It could be from, for whatever reason. But here's an example of a hickory tree. A little bit hard to tell, but this was actually a shagbark hickory. You can see a little bit of that shaggy bark on the side of the tree there. But yeah, about a third of that canopy is left alive, and so it's kind of a sorry tree taking up space that could be better utilized by something else. The tree on the right, the point that I'm illustrating there is that one of the things that we see with unhealthy trees a lot of times is the presence of epicormic sprouts. A lot of times when you see epicormic sprouting occurring on the tree, or lower branches coming off the main stem of a tree, usually that's a sign that that tree is very stressed, and a lot of times that tree is going to be facing death fairly soon. So that epicormic sprouting normally is a kind of a last ditch response to try to survive. So something, the tree recognizes something is severely wrong. I need to try to grow branches that way I can live, even though there's something else, some other issue that's presenting that problem. So when do we conduct a cull tree removal in our woodlands, and how do we do that? Well, as Kathy mentioned, crop tree release is generally advised for relatively young stands, historically ages 20 to 40, although I would argue with some of the research that has gone on at Vinton Furnace State Forest down in southeastern Ohio, you can probably start doing that at much younger ages, 10 to 12 years. Basically, as soon as you're able to start walking through that woodland again, that's the age in which you might be able to start doing crop tree management. With cull tree removal, really what we're looking at is what I would refer to as saw timber size stands, or stands that are about 12 inches in diameter and larger. At that point, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to try to release trees on 2 or 4 sides, just because the amount of space, the amount of openings that you have to create are so great when you're conducting, if you were to try to conduct a crop tree release in these saw timber stands, just because the trees are so much larger, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And so rather than focusing on removing all the trees out from around a crop tree, what we're really trying to do is just focus on removing some of that vegetation. That way we're not making these gaps that take perhaps multiple decades to close up. And so when we're doing this cull tree removal work, we can be doing it with a chainsaw, as you see there on the left, or on the right, those girdling pictures, similar to what Kathy showed you in the sugar bush earlier. Or we could be using herbicide applications. So there are a number of different herbicide applications that can be used to kill trees in our woodlands. It is very important anytime that you are doing any type of pesticide or herbicide application to make sure that you are um, reading the label and making sure that you're following that label because the label is the law, but also make sure, and this is very important, and it goes back to that label, make sure that the herbicide that you're using is actually registered for the type of site that you're planning on using it in. So just because a plant or a herbicide will kill um, a particular grass, for example, there are types of herbicides that will kill grasses, doesn't mean that you can legally use that in a woodland. So that has been an issue that Kathy and I have seen over the last couple of years of people wanting to use a particular chemical to kill Japanese stilt grass, and which I applaud them for wanting to try to use uh, herbicides to kill Japanese stilt grass. It's important to make sure that the herbicide is actually legally allowed to be used in a woodland setting. But the basal bark application, an example of this can be seen on the right side. Essentially what you're doing is you're mixing a herbicide with some type of oil-based carrier, whether that's a diesel, kerosene, or a methylated seed oil. And what that uh, oil carrier does is it allows the active ingredient of the chemical to be pulled in through the bark and reach that layer of the tree that's going to allow that tree to move it down into the root system where it's going to be able to kill the root system and ideally keep that tree from being able to resprout. So normally with this type of treatment, you're spraying the entirety of the lower portion of the stem, usually between 12 to 18 inches above ground level to the point to where it's dripping wet. Occasionally overspray can be a serious concern, and you can get these kind of kill circles where you kill most of the green vegetation around these trees during a basal application. A lot of times this is due to overspray, and one of the things that I especially commonly see is this occurring when you have situations where you're spraying at high pressure. You're going to have less likelihood of um, having those large kill circles or even having kill circles if you're using very low pressure because your droplet size can be a whole lot um, smaller, and you're not going to get that drift of mist that you might get if you're using a really high pressure system. One of the things that it is important to talk about when it comes to using herbicides in woodlands, and this is going to be especially true from a crop tree management standpoint, or if you're doing cull tree management and you are trying to kill the same type of tree that you're also trying to manage for. That's usually a no-no. That's not something that you would want to do. So, for example, if you are wanting to try to manage for white oak, that's the trees that you were primarily managing for, and you had a gnarly looking cull tree that was a white oak growing right next to it, you probably wouldn't want to use herbicide, at least a basal bark application or a systemic herbicide on that white oak to kill it, because oftentimes the root systems of these trees are going to be interconnected under the ground, and that herbicide can move from one stem into the other, which is certainly something that can be problematic if you're killing the trees that you want to keep behind. Another type of herbicide application that can be used is a cut stump treatment. So this is one where you're physically laying the tree on the ground and then treating the top of the stump. There are two different methods for cut stump treatments. One is an oil-based chemical. So similar to the basal spray that we talked about on the previous slide, this cut stump treatment uses that oil-based carrier. And in this case, you're going to be treating the sapwood of the tree. So you don't necessarily, depending on the size of the stem itself, you don't need to treat the heartwood of the tree. But in addition to that sapwood of the tree, you're also treating the lower bark. And that's because that chemical can be pulled through the bark of the tree. The one time of year that it's a poor idea to conduct this type of treatment is during springtime usually, or at other times when you have heavy sap flow. And that's because the tree is going to be essentially trying to push out with sap all the chemical that you're trying to get into that that tree. And again, this being a systemic herbicide, probably don't want to be doing a cut stump treatment for species that you're trying to manage for, as well as some that you're trying to kill. The other version of a cut stump treatment is the water-based version. So there is a difference in how you apply this type of chemical. So this type of chemical is actually only put on the top of the stem and not applied around the outer bark of the stem. And that's because that water isn't going to be able to pass through the bark of the tree and get it into that living layer. So you're just essentially putting it in the sapwood in the cambium layer. The difference between those two pictures on the right, the top, the entire stems are treated. That's because those stems are under 3 inches in diameter. And so most likely it's all sapwood. And so all those materials are conducting, or all those conducting vessels are still active, versus that stem on the right, which is an American beech, might be closer to 8 inches in diameter. And so the idea is that interior wood is just dead heartwood. And so you could put the herbicide there, but essentially you're just wasting your time and your money applying it there, because the herbicide isn't going to move through that tree. Another important distinction when it comes to this type of treatment is that when you're applying the herbicide, it should be, the label will tell you you need to put it on the stem immediately after cutting. And what that means is generally within a few minutes, you need to apply that herbicide. When it comes to the basal treatment that we just talked about in the cut stump, essentially you can come back the next day. You could come back a couple weeks later and apply that, because it has that oil base that's going to allow it to move through those cells, versus in this cut stump treatment, that's water, you're relying on the tree to move it itself, not because the water isn't going to have an ability to really soak through it. Another type of herbicide treatment that we can use is the hack and squirt, or also some type of stem injection, where essentially you're taking a very concentrated herbicide, and there are examples of these herbicides being very, very phytotoxic, meaning they're very good at killing plants. And so while they can be very good at killing what you apply them to, if you're not really careful with these chemicals, they can also be really good about killing their next door neighbors, not the next door, or basically the trees that are next to them. So it is very important to make sure that you're applying them correctly. So essentially what you end up doing is you put these 1-inch wide hacks into a tree. You essentially created a nice pocket for the herbicide to be applied into there. And usually you're putting a milliliter, 2 milliliters of herbicide into that hack, and you're allowing that tree to soak that chemical in. But you are also spacing those hacks out, and depending upon the concentration of herbicide that you're using, and again, you have to really read the label and know what type of chemical you're using to know whether you'd be putting 1 hack per diameter inch, or you might be putting 1 hack per every 3 inches in diameter. But the idea is that you evenly space those hacks around. And it is very important to leave living tissue in between your hacks during this type of method, because we are relying on that tree moving this chemical down through its vascular system. And so if you were to completely girdle this tree, it wouldn't have a tendency of moving that chemical down to the root system nearly as well as if you're leaving portions of the tree alive, being able to translocate that herbicide down to the root system. Some just additional general considerations when it comes to cull tree removal. So taught this material a number of times, and so some of the questions that I generally get are listed on this slide here. So how many cull trees should be controlled? Well, it's going to vary on every situation. But the one thing I do want to mention is there could be a point to where you're removing too many trees from your woodland. You have too many low quality trees, for example, and that you're reducing that woodland to being kind of outside of that ideal range for how trees want to grow and the spacing that they want to have. And so it really is important, as Kathy mentioned, to do an inventory and to know what you have, both the quality of those stems. That way you don't remove too many trees. And really that's, as a landowner, it's probably something you're going to have to get some advice on from a forester or a natural resources professional with regards to, what might be too much. Generally, if you're removing um, a handful of trees per acre, maybe, and really it depends on the size of your woodland. This could greatly vary, but if you're removing 10 to 20 trees per acre, that's probably okay. If you're wanting to try to remove 50 trees per acre, they better be really small trees, uh, or you could be removing too much material. What can you do with the cull trees? If you want, you can leave them there. You can leave them laying on the ground, allow them to rot back into the ground, or you can harvest those trees for firewood. And usually, because these trees are very low value trees, there's probably not a lot of other economic benefit from these trees. Um, so harvesting them, producing them into firewood. Uh, is there a drawback to producing firewood? Well, it's a lot of work, and um, but from a nutrient cycling standpoint, most of the nutrients of a tree are going to be tied up in the fine branches of the tree and the root system, and not in the kind of the wood of the tree, especially the main trunk of the tree. And so, removing those larger portions of the tree for firewood is not going to have a significant impact upon the quality of the trees that you're able to grow in the forest in the future, because of a loss of nutrients, uh, which is highly beneficial for us. So what do we do if we want to control resprouting, or if we think the trees that we're going to be cutting are going to resprout? Because all our hardwood trees are capable of resprouting. Now, if we got into managing conifer stands where you maybe have a white pine stand, there'd be no need to worry about resprouting because they don't have the ability to do that following being cut down. But all of our hardwoods do have that ability to resprout. Um, and so you'd probably be wanting to look at a chemical application to those trees, or you might consider girdling. Girdling the trees will, while those trees will tend to resprout at the base after a number of years, they tend to burn up a lot of their resources and the nutrients that they have in their root system, trying to feed that above ground portion that they're trying to and struggling to keep alive. And so it's a way of reducing the ability of that tree to resprout long term, so it can survive for a little while, but eventually it will succumb to that girdling. So what do you do if you find an area and it's nothing but low quality trees, which happens? I mean, I've got 23 acres in Hocking County, and a couple areas on my property, it's almost nothing but low quality trees. Fortunately for me, they're not really big areas. So what do I do? Some of the places I skip it, just don't do anything. It doesn't make sense to remove low quality trees sometimes to benefit other low quality trees. Take time to remove low quality trees where you're actually accomplishing some type of good. Or what you could consider doing is making a group opening. So removing all those low quality trees from a given area, and it could be something the size of a quarter acre, in the hopes of creating some nice young brushy habitat for wildlife, as well as hoping that you get some better quality trees to grow back into that area. One important caveat to mention when it comes to any of these types of treatments, when we're talking about removing trees, we as foresters don't want to just go in and kind of remove trees willy-nilly, just randomly selecting trees. Oh, I'm going to remove that one. I will remove that one, because there's always a chance that the space that that tree was taking up could be occupied by something worse. And what that could be is invasive species. So we always want to make sure that there's a good reason for removing the trees that we're removing. Otherwise, we could make um, our forest less productive. So we'll kind of switch gears here and talk about mid-story removal or mid-story control. And so the idea with this is going to be slightly different than a cull tree removal. So normally the focus of this is trying to get rid of the the smaller trees within the woodland. Usually these are trees that are taking up a lot of sunlight and not allowing much sunlight to reach the forest floor. That way we can get an establishment of new seedlings and saplings growing on that woodland floor. So this is something that I talk about a lot in oak hickory management, where down here in southeastern Ohio, our forests look a lot like the photo that you're seeing there in the center, where the overstory trees, the big dominant trees in our stand are our oak trees, there are hickory trees. But if you start looking at those middle-sized trees and kind of the trees that are in the about halfway up the heights of those big dominant trees, a lot of times those are maple trees, they're beech trees, they're black gum trees, and they take up a lot of sunlight. And so we don't have many oaks that can grow on the understory of this stand. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to remove some of those, that midstory out of, get that midstory out of the way. That way we can start growing oaks and hickories or desired species on the understory. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a look at of a forest and the types of trees that we'd be removing in a midstory removal, generally we're talking about removing the lower half of the canopy essentially. So those trees that are kind of considered up in the canopy, but they're not dominating the stand, or they're not kind of co-dominating the stand, but rather they're the smaller trees within the stand. And what does this do? So here I have kind of progression of photos actually coming out of the University of Kentucky, where the picture on the left you can see has a lot of, in this case, either red maple or sugar maple growing in that mid story, but very, very dense. And if you were to look on the forest floor underneath that maple, you'd find very little herbaceous material, very few other seedlings other than very shade tolerant plants. What does it look like afterwards? Well, in the center there, you can see kind of what often people kind of really love seeing is like a park-like setting for their woodlands, even though that might not necessarily be a really healthy thing. That park-like setting that we oftentimes uh, really appreciate being able to walk through might not necessarily be an indicator of that being a really healthy woodland. However, you do get a really open woodland, but after the fact, after the sunlight's able to reach that forest floor, it will encourage a whole lot of growth and development of a lot of seedlings and saplings, creating a really nice, hopefully a really nice, rich diversity of not only woody plants, but also herbaceous plants, grasses, and sedges. Um, Anytime you're removing trees from the canopy, there is the chance, as I mentioned, that something worse could take its place. And so it's always important to follow up and make sure that we're controlling those non-native invasive species and not making the problem worse in the long run. So why do I talk about this issue of kind of red maple kind of dominating the mid-story? Well, if we look at our oak and hickory stands, when maple invades those stands, when they dominate that mid-story, what we see is a 90% reduction in the species composition of herbaceous species. And what this results in is a drastic loss of biodiversity because all those different herbaceous plants, as long as supposing that they are native, they have and support a number of insects, amphibians, uh, small mammals, and songbirds that are commonly associated with those species. And so as we have an invasion of maple in these oak hickory forests, we're actually losing diversity not only of plants, but potentially losing diversity of wildlife species growing within those woodlands as well. An additional purpose behind the removal of the mid-story, um, as I mentioned, is kind of getting through that stand, opening up that understory to sunlight. And we're commonly doing this in our oak hickory woodlands by removing trees like red maple. That's the primary species of concern down here in southeastern Ohio, even though it's perfectly acceptable and appropriate to be managing for red maple in certain areas. While I don't do it in my oak hickory forest, if I had a sugar bush red maple is going to be a great tree to try to manage for. In places in northern Ohio, red maple might be one of the more valuable timber trees that you're able to grow in a particular forest. And so, I'm not trying to encourage everybody to just go out and control all the red maple on their property. In areas it makes sense, and really you have to go back to why do you own your property? What do you have that's there? And how do you appropriately make those decisions to manage in the future? Um, but down here in southeastern Ohio, when we're talking about oak hickory management, we're also looking at removing a lot of shade tolerant species. These are trees that are taking up a lot of sunlight: American beech, black gum, sourwood, sassafras, um, and others, just depending upon the given situation. And what that does is it greatly increases the amount of sunlight that reaches the forest floor. And as that happens, uh, you're able to get oak and hickory to be able to begin to be established on that forest floor. That way, when it comes time to reproduce that forest, when it comes time to perhaps harvest timber, or when you have a great windstorm or ice storm that comes through and kills a bunch of the overstory in the canopy, you have small oak and hickory seedlings there ready to take the place of the trees above. And so really, when we're thinking about mid-story management, really we're thinking about this maybe 10 to 20 years in advance of a harvest. So if I'm thinking, well, I'm hoping to retire someday, and when I retire, I'd maybe like to harvest timber off my property to be able to support some type of activity. So one of the things that my wife and I have talked about is, when we retire, maybe one of those years shortly after, we want to visit all the national parks across the country. One of the ways in which we might be able to generate the income to be able to do that is by having a timber harvest. And so if essentially we might, such as myself, might be looking at retiring maybe in 20 years, who knows? There's a lot of years between now and then. One of the things that I would want to be doing if I'm harvesting timber 20 years from now is to start looking at what I have on my forest floor and making sure that the way I'm managing the light that's reaching my forest floor is such that I'm establishing the trees on the ground that I want to be in my forest in the future. So after that forest, because my personal preference on my property is to manage for oak and hickory. If I don't manage for the oak and hickory now and then those next 10 to 20 years, and I do some type of harvesting, almost regardless of the type of harvesting that I do, unless I'm doing a lot of other types of treatments along with it, I'm not getting oak and hickory back. I'm going to be at least not getting oak and hickory back in a way that's going to dominate the site, dominate the forest like they currently do. So if I want to reproduce the forest that I currently have, I've got to do a lot of work over the next 10 to 20 years to get it to be that situation. And fortunately, being a forester and somebody who's actively managing their land, I have been doing some of that work over the last 5 to 10 years. So there is an additional purpose and additional benefit to mid-story removal. So those trees that you're leaving behind have more resources. So they may be getting additional access to sunlight. They may be getting additional access to moisture or nutrients. And so those trees that you're leaving behind are going to have a higher survival rate. They're going to have increased rates of growth, not only in terms of their canopies, but also their diameters. And anytime we talk about increasing the growth rates of our canopies, generally what that means is healthier crowns is going to equal more seed production for those folks that are really interested in managing these stands for wildlife. Just want to show you a couple photos from my own property where instead of doing a bunch of mechanical removal of trees to do mid-story control work, instead I've used prescribed fire. And so prescribed fire could be a tool used to reduce those small diameter trees in your stand to increase the amount of sunlight within the woodlands. Not right for everybody, not right everywhere, but it is a potential option that some folks may want to consider. And if you're really interested in prescribed fire, we did sometime, I think earlier this year or late last year, we had a webinar through Ohio Woodland Stewards covering the topic of prescribed fire and its use. You could go back to that Ohio Woodland Stewards webpage and find that recording to be able to watch that. And one of the things that I wanted to end with is, okay, so I really like some of the ideas of crop tree management or cull tree removal or doing some of this mid-story control work, but I just don't have the time maybe to do it myself. My pockets aren't deep enough to be able to pay somebody to do this type of work. What can I do? Well, you can in every county, there's a Natural Resource Conservation Service has an office. You can go in there and talk to your district conservationist, ask them about the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. This is a program, it's a federal program that provides technical and financial assistance importantly, to not only agricultural producers, but also to forest landowners to address natural resources concerns. And so these types of treatments that we've talked about today all have some type of financial incentive tied to them to where potentially you can be rewarded or incentivized to do some really good forestry work within your woodland. And I would highly encourage you to reach out to your district conservationist within NRCS. Another place that you can get help with this type of work is with the Division of Forestry, if you're looking at doing forestry activities, or with the Division of Wildlife. So either reaching out to service foresters or wildlife consultants with the Division of Wildlife could be a very good way to start getting some information and determining if this program might be right for you. And with that, I think it is time for us to open things up for questions. And so if I can get back to my screen, I will. Oh, maybe I did already stop sharing.
You did. Nope, you're still sharing.
Nope.
That's okay. We can see your contact information. Thank you,
Okay.
Jim and Kathy. Excellent presentation. Before we get to the questions, just to let you know, there were a couple things popped into the chat box as we were going along. Kathy shared the fact sheet for stiltgrass control, so scroll up and look for that. And then I just sent the link to the prescribed fire webinar that Jim referred to as well. That is also posted on our website. So let's get to the questions. All right. Kurt is asking, what is the best management strategy if your woodlot is heavily populated with beech and BLD is present, beech leaf disease?
You want to take that one, Kathy? It's more in your neck of the woods than fortunately
Yeah,
we
nice
don't have
try.
that yet in southeastern Ohio.
Nice try.
That's a complicated one though.
It is a complicated one. And I think that while we know more about beech leaf disease than we did a couple of years ago, there are still a lot of unanswered questions, and there are no great answers yet on how to deal with it. As some of the research moves along, we will learn more, but I've always said to folks, tree research tends to take a long time. So it's a case of, I probably would look at those beech that are showing severe symptoms, well into the disease and well into kind of falling apart and probably on the way to falling out of the stand. You could remove those and try with that removal. You may get some better growth on some of the other ones that could compensate for some things. But until we have some better answers, I just don't think that there's one set to give you. I mean, we know some of what's going on. There are some chemicals that are being looked at, some pesticides to see, but again, it's always tough in a woodland scenario. So we may be able to afford to treat a yard beech, but the odds of being able to treat efficiently, cost effectively, beech in a woods, I think it'll be just like emerald ash borer. You know, we had a lot of folks ask, can I treat my ash? Well, you can, but, and I know some woodland owners that are treating ash in their woods, but it's not cheap and you're still going to lose some. So unfortunately, when it's a woodland scenario, unless it's something easily treated, I think that it's a case of you're going to have to look at a future with either, I don't want to say no beech because it's not impacting everything, but maybe fewer beech, unfortunately. And I
Yeah,
know that's
just
a horrible answer.
yeah, it's about as good of an answer as we can give. The one thing that I would mention is see what you can do to increase the health and vigor of any of the trees in your woodland. Those trees that are healthy, more vigorous, are going to be most likely more resistant to the impacts of beech leaf disease.
Yeah, so like I said, the ones that maybe the canopy is almost gone or extremely impacted, I mean, it's time to think about taking that one out, opening up the stand, allowing the remaining trees to have more sunlight and nutrients. So it's probably the best that we've got at this point.
Great. Folks, just need to say real quick that there are some webinars on our website that, oh, okay, well, that linked work. Okay, well, good. If you were to click on a webinar on our website and it says the link does not exist, it just means that I need to move them over to our YouTube site. So I will work on that as well. But I posted the link where you can get to all of our webinars. And even if you can't access one, you will just shortly. So bear with me there. All right, next question. Can you talk about the equipment needed to do an extensive thinning? What equipment is used at your plots? What time of year?
So if you're talking about equipment to actually conduct the thinning itself, really depends on the how you plan on doing it. Most of the time on my own property, I'm just doing it with a chainsaw. So chainsaw, gas and oil, and personal protective equipment, and you're off and you're running. But if you're talking about how do you inventory that woodland, how do you go about making sure that the trees that you're going to be cutting are the right ones and making sure that you have places to fell those trees if you're going to be cutting them down, is a little bit of a different task. And that's one where you're going to really probably need the help of a natural resource professional or a forester, at least in getting started. And so one of our recommendations is to start putting up flagging of trees that you think you'd want to keep and trees that you think you'd want to cut down. That way you can get a really good visual as to what you're looking at, and then run it by a forester and natural resource professionals and get their opinion as to, ooh, you're probably removing too many trees, or you could really remove some more if you wanted to. Just that way you're not, as you're getting started, you're not making a kind of a mistake and setting yourself back. But then kind of once you would get a feel for the thinning or the types of trees that you're removing, that would be a whole lot easier to move throughout the rest of your woodlands. But you really need to be able to find a place that you know looks right, and that's how you want it to look, and then be able to try to mimic and emulate that throughout the rest of your woodlands.
And the question on the plots, again, Jim's right. We used a chainsaw and a squirt bottle of herbicide to put into those double girdles, because while we double girdled the first year with the lack of success, when we went through and re-girdled, we applied herbicide to try to do a double whammy. It's like, you're going to die. We want to make certain you die instead of watching them just kind of laugh at us and continue to grow. So,
Okay, we have a couple herbicide questions. One is from James, and he's asking when using hack and squirt, can you offset hacks with vertical overlap without girdling the tree?
It's really important to have that horizontal distance in between the hacks because you really need that live living tissue to translocate that
Oop.
He froze. I think he was saying to translocate it down.
Yeah, did we
Hopefully.
lose him?
All right. Well, hopefully we get Jim back. I don't know if you wanted to finish that question
Well,
up.
I mean, I wasn't paying as much attention as, so, yes, I think he was talking about the tissue. You need tissue that is still connected in order to move the herbicides up and down the tree. And so, yes, you don't want to overlap to the point where you're severing that connective tissue. So I would say one ring around with the gaps in between is what you're looking for.
Yeah. Okay. And then there was somebody asking about killing calorie pair with hack and squirt. Is that one of the ones with diffuse pores? Do they have to double girdle?
So calorie pair should be, I'm thinking it should be ring porous. Let me look at something because the family that it is in. Yeah, I don't have that one listed.
I mean, if my Google AI search is correct, it says diffuse. If somebody else in the chat or in the webinar knows, plop it in there. But
So here's my theory. If you don't know, then
Yeah.
go deep because it doesn't take you any more time. It's just instead of doing maybe an inch in depth, you're going to do an inch and a half. So if there's any question on any species when you're doing that girdle, you just need to make certain that you're going deep enough, and going too deep isn't an issue. So if you have any questions about any species, whether it's diffuse or ring, you just go deeper. I mean, go a couple inches deep. And there's also the reality that if you're doing a small enough tree, it's probably just as simple to cut it down and treat the stump than it is to try, because by the time you go all the way around with an inch, inch and a half, 2 inches in depth, there's probably not a whole lot of tissue there, tree,
Good point.
holding it up. So
Right.
there is a point where they're small enough that you might as well just drop them because it's probably going to be easier.
Okay. And then Bob had a question on the crop trees. So why didn't you basal spray your non-crop trees, which is much faster and allows the trees to die slowly and come down on their own in 3 to 4 years?
So partly because there were enough large trees that were going to have to be girdled, and basil would not have been effective because of their size. And so when you've got limited crew access and limited time, we just did them all as girdles. There's probably some smaller ones. Yes, we could have done basil spray, but we would have ended up having to do 2 different processes. And like I said, for us on the Mansfield campus, we don't have a crew. We have some student interns that get used. We actually had a Division of Forestry crew that came over to do the girdling. So it was basically resource oriented.
Okay. Ren is asking about cut stump method for honeysuckle. He said he's had stumps as large as a foot or more in diameter. How much of a stump is sapwood that should be hit with herbicide?
Generally, what I think, and sorry about dropping off there, we lost connection in the Hawking office to our internet, so I had to get on our phone. So I'm back, and we still don't have internet,
Need a
but
pivot.
yeah,
Technology.
yes, at least I got through the presentation fine. Otherwise,
Yeah.
we'd be hurting. But so generally, if you're using a water-based chemical there, the cambium layer and how much is the sapwood, I would go probably at least a couple inches. A lot of times you can start to see a color differentiation between the sapwood and the heartwood. So if you're seeing a really distinctive color difference in the center of the tree, that would be the point at which you would not need to apply any type of herbicide to it. But generally, a couple inches around the outside of the tree should be pretty sufficient.
Great. Can you both give some recommendations on the different types of herbicides needed to do these different treatments? Yeah, I know sometimes we hesitate putting those in fact sheets as they change, but what might you share with folks?
I guess I'll give my standard pesticide training answer is that Jim's right. It depends on the site. You have to use things that can be used in a woods. There are some standard ones that we use, like imazapyr and triclopyr and glyphosate. Those are probably the three, and they all come under different brand names. But you have to make certain that what is on the label is the practice that you're going to do. And many times for the species, the site is critical, but sometimes when you read through for species, some labels will say not to be used on such and such, or, so yeah, there's like those three that I always kind of put, and I always say those are the ones that we've been using for years. They're pretty standard. Doesn't mean there aren't better things out there, but the more you look at some other things, you really need to read the label and make certain that what's on the label matches what you're trying to do. But we do have fact sheets. Jim's been updating fact sheets right and left. That you can look at herbicide suggestions, but we've had some issues in the last few years about wrong chemicals, wrong site kind of thing, and the label's the law.
Yep.
So the one thing that I would add to that, and I was going to start out with what you just ended with, is figure out what you're trying to kill and then find a fact sheet for that particular species, because there's no silver bullets to woody plants when it comes to herbicides. While imazapyr, for example, tends to be a herbicide that is very phytotoxic, it does not work well against all woody plants. And so one of our predecessors, Randy Heiligman, created a fact sheet on the relative effectiveness of herbicides to, I think, common woody plants, which unfortunately I'm on my phone, so I can't find that link and be able to post it into the website. But that will show you, give you a listing of some different chemicals and how effective it is against certain species. So just anecdotally, while we commonly use glyphosate for forestry applications, it's not really particularly great about killing red maple, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So so that's what I would say. There's no silver bullet, and really find a fact sheet, and then reach out to professionals in your area that are seeing it and doing it. So reach out to a service forester in your county and get a recommendation from a forestry professional for your site. So not all chemicals can be used in all areas. So especially if you have riparian areas, that's going to limit the types of herbicides that you can use in that area.
And it goes along with, for a lot of our invasive species, you should also be looking at adding surfactants, because most of our invasive species have kind of a waxy coating, and the last thing you want is for the herbicide to just kind of roll off. So you want it to adhere. So you will see, you want to make certain that you either buy an herbicide that already has surfactant in it, an additional surfactant, which there are some out there, or some of the newer ones don't have any at all, and you have to add. And at that point, you add surfactants based on, are you in an upland scenario, or are you in an aquatic scenario? So make certain there too that you're using the right practice.
Great. Along those lines of kind of like another resource, James is asking, do you have any good sources for determining stocking level? Also across a management timeline in an upland mixed mesophytic forest.
So it's a really good document. It's kind of old. I think it might be from the 60s or 70s. So it's Agricultural Handbook 355. It's the
USDA forest law.
silvicultural prescription. Yeah, silvicultural prescriptions for upland or for upland central hardwoods, I think is the name of that. So Agricultural Handbook 355, silviculture prescriptions for upland central hardwoods, or something very similar to that. But that's a fairly lengthy document, but that document can walk you through the practice of being able to inventory your forest, and it will give you a protocol to do. And it actually will go a step further and give you, based upon your inventory and the analysis of that data, it will give you some stand level prescription information. So it will tell you how you could potentially manage that forest. The one thing that it is really limited to is it's really was limited to managing for kind of timber species in mind. And so managing for trees that really fit the site really well. And so it doesn't do a good job of, if you're wanting to switch the composition of your forest from being dominated by oak to dominated by something else, or you're having problems with such and such species, it's not going to account for that very well, but it can be a good place to start.
Great. We have a question on climate change impacts, species that are going to be more stressed, or those that may thrive, those that may be more easily damaged by storms. Any information, and I know we've done a few webinars on climate impacts, so we can reference those as well.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have access to internet right now, but I do have a really excellent document that I can try to share with Marnie in case that you all haven't seen it. But basically what it does is it walks through the woodlands, at least it may be tied to more southeastern Ohio, and it talks about kind of the winners and losers with regards to what we expect climate change to occur within the next 100 years. Generally speaking, there's a number of species that are going to seem to fare very well under climate change, like most of our oaks, most of our hickories fall into that category. Sugar maple, red maple, which are common trees, are going to be probably somewhat reduced by climate change, or at least climate change isn't probably going to be beneficial for them, even though red maple is expected to increase their dominance across the landscape.
Maple's a winner.
I think yellow
climate.
Yeah. Yeah. It really varies by region of the state or region of the country that you're in. But there are some documents out there that the Forest Service has produced that covers that information.
You can go to the tree atlas, the climate change tree atlas, and look up your species. And though they have several models that they use to look at what's going to change, and they've updated it. They're on like version 4 of the atlas. You can go in and pick a species and see what the predictions are, zone wise. And so that would be another one to take a look at that could give you some. It's going to be a broader picture, but you can look at Ohio in those maps that they have predicted.
Yep, and I just popped the link to the climate change webinar that we did, and it's all about the tree atlas. So if you want to learn a little bit more about it too. Okay. Let's get through a few more of these questions. Jennifer has a question about EQIP, and if either of you are comfortable talking about the state of EQIP funding and what's going on with all of the budget cuts and things like that. And if you don't know, that's fine too.
So I can speak to that a little bit. I happen to be married to the state forester, essentially, who works for the Division of Forestry, but she's the state forester for NRCS. And so she deals with EQIP on a very regular basis. And so I hear a fair amount of that. So last year, the amount of EQIP contracts in forestry that were selected and funded was greatly reduced from previous years as a result of a reduction in grant funding coming out of the Farm Bill. It's very unclear how that will carry on through the future. It's going to be very much dependent upon a new Farm Bill and when that gets passed. A bit of good news while we're in kind of that limbo state of not really knowing how much funding there will be with EQIP. For those people who have already signed up for EQIP in previous years and didn't get funded, the Division of Forestry has a separate pot of money that is going to be used to help fund some of those projects. And so it seems like the Division of Forestry is going to be able to use a fairly substantial amount of money that was obtained through a grant to pay for some EQIP stuff that didn't get already funded. However, if you are just new to EQIP, that's not going to do you very much good. But the Division of Wildlife does have a pretty new program that they're rolling out. And I'm not sure, Marnie, if you're more familiar with that than what I am, and if you could say a few words about that wildlife program, because there are some kind of restrictions that limit it to not just woodland management.
Yeah, I think so. It's the Wildlife Habitat Incentives Program, and there are quite a few practices that will qualify under that. I do know that they are giving priority to upland habitats, kind of more of that grassland pollinator, but that doesn't mean that forest management can't factor in as well. If you're interested in that, the recommendation is to reach out to your wildlife consultant, which are the folks that work through the Ohio Division of Wildlife. And I will pop up the link to a map so you can figure out who your consultant is, and they can kind of get you started on that process and to see if you qualify. Okay, James is asking, so is production equivalent to a certain metric or a desired metric like tree growth, sap production, fruit production, etc.?
So generally, when I'm talking about production in a woodland situation, I'm talking about it two ways. One of which would be in terms of board footage, so the amount of volume that's being produced on that land. But then also, I will commonly refer to production from a mass standpoint, referring to how much seed, how much fruit our trees are going to be able to produce. So I refer to it a couple different ways.
And production on the maple side is literally sap production. The more sap you get, the more gallons of syrup, hopefully. But factored into that, as you saw on the graphs from Mansfield, you can have a lot of sap production, but if it's low sugar value, you're going to be boiling more. So in the end result of production, you may have more inputs on fuel to boil. So you really would like to have those open canopies that had higher sugar content, maybe less sap production, but that means less boiling and perhaps, out the other end, production that ends up being a little more economical for the woodland owner.
Laura is asking about Asian jumping worms in Ohio woodlands, and are they affecting new seedlings?
All the reports we've had on the jumping worms in our Glidden app have come out of gardens. I don't know that I have anybody that's reported one with the app, at least in the woods.
I feel like Kayla was just saying that they found them.
Did they?
Somewhere. Stay tuned, because I'm hoping next year to do either a class on Asian jumping worms through Woodland Stewards, or at the very least a webinar. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
I mean, we are getting some reports, but like I said, the ones that I've seen haven't been an issue in woods, but worms in woods are not great anyhow. So I'm not certain if it matters which
Soil
worm.
compaction. Yeah. Yeah.
They are impacting reproduction. So, and they're
And
hard
I
to.
think that these worms are particularly more impactful in the parts of the states that have been glaciated because there are no worms that are native to there. Whereas in the unglaciated part of the state, there are some native worms, and that's, which means that there's probably some native predators and things to them that might be able to help hold some of those Asian jumping worm populations in check a little bit, maybe. Although I don't think they're necessarily down in this part of the state yet.
No, they're, I think it's northeastern. If
Yeah.
I don't want to say exactly where because I'm not 100%, but yeah. And Kathleen just noted if you can't wait for a webinar, it seems Penn State Extension just did one on Asian jumping worms. So hopefully you can search that one out. Okay, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to stop the recording. And while Kathy puts the link up for continuing education credits in just a second, I'll ask Jim another question. So thank you all so much, and I'm going to stop the recording.